So welcome to our panel. The title that was given for the panel was actually just the title I gave for my paper. And actually, we're just going to call our panel Talking About Today's War, or Wars. And just to let you know what's going to happen is we're not necessarily going to talk about Iraq or Afghanistan per se, you know, contemporary wars that the United States was involved with or is involved with currently. We're going to talk more about the nature of contemporary war and how its form is changing and why we think it's important for us, especially those of us who are committed to ending a state of war that exists or changing the priorities of this country away from engaging in permanent war and permanent wars, need to understand the new directions that warfare itself is taking. And this is not at the tactical level of, you know, the soldier's eye view, but rather at the more theoretical level, which many people in the military today around the world and in the academic community and in the peace and justice community are starting to think about, that range from the rise of what people call wars of the people, counterinsurgency warfare, insurgencies, asymmetric warfare, total war, the rise of drones, special forces, and things like that. We want to talk about that. I think it's our sense, Tim and myself, that the paradigm of war is changing, and for us to respond to that, we need to understand it. So that's the gist of this panel discussion, which may be different than what some people had in mind, but that's what we're planning to do. So my name is Steve Niva. I teach here at the Evergreen State College. I teach in politics, international politics, and Middle East studies. And I've been here for about 12 years. And I will talk second, and our first speaker is going to be Tim Russell, who teaches at Tacoma Community College currently and is also active with many anti-war groups, particularly focused on nuclear weapons and their abolition, among other things. So I will turn it over to Tim to start the panel.
Thanks, Steve. My talk is going to be pretty darn short. I have some expertise about some certain things, but looking around the room, there's people that have at least or more expertise than I do about certain things. I'm going to talk mostly about a concern that I have called, I guess the term that I found that is most useful is total war, limitless war, and what I see to be some tendencies towards that with some of the characteristics of modern war fighting. Just to back up, I came to Evergreen State College way back in '86 to join the war program. That's what attracted me here. It was a great program. Went on to get a master's at UWT in a similarly wonderful program, also interdisciplinary. I want people to consider going there. It was called Foundations of Public Action, a really great program. I'm also the owner of Rainy Day Records. I agree with Steve that war, this thing, no small topic, is a changing creature. We need to understand the animal as it is today in order to be able to respond to it. And one of the biggest problems is that it is more and more hidden from view. And then Steve's going to talk quite a bit about that, I think, with how we are fighting war through the use of drones. I'm going to give just a little bit of an overview based on kind of a paper that I wrote while I was doing the master's program in Tacoma. Because I teach sociology these days, I need to slip in a little sociology. C. Wright Mills said it's very important that we understand who we are in the times that we live. So going forward, to understand what is contemporary war, what are some of the characteristics. And yeah, we're talking about war, one of the most destructive, costly things that human beings do in terms of loss of life, in terms of the environment, long-term damage to already vulnerable populations. Should we talk about U.S. military spending for a moment? Do we need to? I think we're all pretty aware, $759 billion a year. We spend more in this country than almost all other countries combined, and it's for homeland security, national security, or empire. Well, I'll leave that to you. It's outside of the scope of our discussion today. It's an enormous conversation, but if we're looking at directing that kind of money towards empire, we should think a little more seriously, even about whether our aggressive posture actually serves us, even in that goal. We're just coming off of Iraq and Afghanistan. I think much of the public is a little confused about our current state. Are we still at war? In many ways, this shows just how hidden it is. It's fallen out of as a media topic. It's just not on television quite like it was. I would like to see us coming off the heels of Iraq and Afghanistan to go through another Vietnam syndrome. I don't know if people know that term, and how we were out of the war business to some extent. Don't get me wrong, we were still spending, but we were not mobilizing to enact war in other countries for a period because we didn't have a stomach for it. So many loss of lives. For what? People were asking ourselves. Will we be asking the same questions on the heels of Iraq and Afghanistan? I hope so. I hope that the brakes are put on the war machine to some extent. But sadly, I think we're moving really in much the opposite direction. Instead of brakes, we are moving towards, again, what I call total war, where it is more hidden, where more of our resources are exerted towards this thing called war. The term total war has been used throughout history. It's not the greatest term, but it feels appropriate as an organizing concept for some of the characteristics of war these days. It's been used in World War I, where troops on the battlefield used gas that would then blow into civilian populations, and so it was an example of how war was becoming more total, and that civilians were losing their lives more in this regard. It was also used in World War II to talk about firebombing, the fact that civilians were now legitimate targets. Was there a discussion about this? No, we were trying to win the war. And so civilians were dying like never before in this firebombing. Total war was also a term used in the nuclear age by Curtis LeMay to describe an entire nuclear exchange where we might be looking at killing entire nations. There I need to say, folks, we still have these weapons. They are still largely on alert. We have, yes, reduced our stockpiles, but maybe you're familiar with a term that we had used talking about the nuclear era, that we had enough firepower to make the rubble bounce. So not only could we destroy civilizations, but we could continue to fire nuclear weapons. We still have many more than is even necessary for a nuclear winter. Yet, it's hidden. In fact, I bought a year ago a coffee table book made by a fellow who went and took pictures of some of the nuclear weapons that are deployed because he felt like they had fallen out of view, and maybe if we had this picture book on our coffee table, that we would be reminded that these things are still there. So, total war, limitless war, moving to an era where there are fewer restrictions. The public sees that there are fewer costs. Maybe you recall the Quadrennial Defense Review, one of the most important policy papers the US issues from a little while ago, heralding the long war. Sounds like we would really never have peacetime again. The couple of examples that I used in my writing during my master's time to suggest that we're in this limitless war period, this total war period, ubiquitous, continual, fluid. are private military companies and their rise, and the rise of precision-guided munitions and distance killing. There are other examples, such as the failure of international cooperative agreements. We are now able to put weapons into space because the Outer Space Treaty was abrogated. We're refusing to sign a comprehensive test ban treaty, also related to nuclear weapons. And the Obama administration, Democratic, but we can't sign a landmine treaty. So international law is not putting the brakes, is not providing limits. Back to private military companies, Peter Singer has written a couple of really terrific books. One about private military companies called Corporate Warriors a few years ago. And he talks about, one, how private military firms are on the rise. It used to be something like a 10-to-1 ratio of public to private. Now it's closer to a 4-to-1 ratio. Private military firms are used not just like made some press that Blackwater drove around in an SUV shooting at civilians. There are cases where they're just working in the mess hall. But yes, they are sometimes with weapons, and there's not the accountability that there are, the limited accountability that is the case with our actual military, public military. Peter Singer writes that the privatized military industry provides an employment opportunity for those previously drawn towards mercenary work or who have been forced out of public military activities for past misdeeds. While some private military mercenaries might have scruples, many do not.
What's that book on mercenaries called?
It's called Corporate Warriors. Wired for War is his most recent book. Singer also writes in Corporate Warriors that the public military forces have all manner of traditional controls over their activities, ranging from internal checks and balances, domestic laws regulating the activities of the military force and its personnel. Didn't really happen at My Lai and other examples, but that there is parliamentary scrutiny, public opinion, and numerous aspects of international law. That's a quote from his Corporate Warriors. But PMFs, private military firms, however, are only subject to the laws of the market. This is an example of war that is less limited. Another example are precision-guided munitions and distance killing. This is a trend that's begun some time ago, but really made its hallmark with the Kosovo War, where U.S. forces did not land a single troop, no boots on the ground, and thus not a single life lost. Many positive aspects to not losing lives, yes, but for the American public, are there incentives not to carry out war through these means? Not really, not the same as when there are actual costs that are more visible. So these couple examples are ways that war is changing. Drones, which Steve will talk about, lack of legislation, international cooperation, are others. Theorists like Paul Virilio talk about how surveillance is nearing to be complete. To be seen is to be killed. We're moving to really a brave new world. We must pay attention, remain vigilant in describing this kind of war that is not making the headlines that sometimes war used to. Other things that used to limit war, such as just war principles, are not talked about. Keep in mind also that we're coming off of two wars that were the most taxing on troops. We talk about stop loss, and the least taxing on US civilians. We got a tax break. So is this kind of thing going to lead us to second guess the next time the administration asks us to go to war? I don't think so. And that is what I wanted to share.
I'm in complete agreement with what Tim just talked about, as I think that is the dominant trend that we have to be thinking about, is that war is on the surface disappearing, but it's not going away. What's happening is that it's becoming increasingly embedded in the social fabric of our lives, and we don't see it. And it's also increasingly becoming embedded in actual governance of both at home and abroad, in ways that we're only now starting to understand. Tim used a quote to begin with from the great sociologist C. Wright Mills. I'll use one from the great critical thinker Walter Benjamin. He says, "In times of terror, everyone has to become a detective." And I think that's what we all have to do. We all have to start trying to understand. We have to figure out. We have to become detectives ourselves to understand where war is going, because it's going away from the surface. It's going away from the big spectacle. I think that's the big story that's happening. When we hear about war today, increasingly, it's only through a YouTube video here, a report smuggled out, a tweet or a Twitter or a Facebook posting, or some way in which the information is getting out, because it's increasingly spreading to areas in which and in means of which we don't typically have the big focus on. So I agree with Tim that that's the direction. Let me talk about a couple things. And the first thing I want to talk about is the rise of what we could call robotic warfare, which is another way of talking about drones. Drones are essentially robots. I think it's important for us to think about this. They are machines that we program to do things for us. They are, a drone is a pilotless aircraft. So that means it's being controlled from the outside. It's not quite autonomous, although there are autonomous aspects of it, but it's an extension of, I think, a broader story of robotic warfare that Peter Singer talks about in Wired for War. Now, drones have been getting, I think, the most attention in this sort of new landscape of war, and I think there are good reasons for that. We now have drones that are circling the planet, that are circling territories abroad and at home. They are eyes in the sky. They primarily serve a surveillance function, so they're extending the view of, they're essentially extending what could be a battle space around the world. But increasingly they're armed, and they engage in acts of violence. They can be used for assassinations. The Israeli military has pioneered the use of drones as vehicles of assassination. They can also be used in destroying buildings, objects, and other things at this point. There's a massive proliferation in drones today, and it's really only happened in the last 6 years to maybe 10 years. Let's say 6 years ago, probably 10 countries had some kind of drone industry or ability to use drones. Today, it's 65 to 70 countries now. And just last week, we learned that the use of drones has now, that states no longer have the monopoly on drones. Last week, a Shiite militant group from Lebanon, Hezbollah, actually flew a drone over Israel. They claim they flew it over Israel's nuclear weapons production facility in Dimona. I don't think they actually made it to Dimona. The Israelis shot it down before them, but they showed that they could launch a drone. A non-state actor, a militant group, using drones in warfare. This is crossing a Rubicon, and it's crossing something that the United States and Israel actually have opened up, because they've been so aggressive in promoting drone warfare, in promoting the technologies of drone warfare, that we're in an age of what people would call open source warfare. Technology is out there, people can use it, and before too long, I'm sure the Mexican drug cartels are going to be using drones. I'm sure even individual actors. Let's hope partners having a fight won't use drones with each other's, but I think we're headed to the increasing socialization of the use of drones. Yeah, can you imagine? I think it's a new reality show. Look for it. So we have the rise of drones, and I think it's getting a lot of attention in the US, and again, for good reason. It's really been under the Obama administration that the American use of drones has skyrocketed. But part of that just reflects the fact that these ground wars and ground counterinsurgency wars that were so disastrous created, that we're passing them by. And in a sense, the new wars are less about ground wars. And I think this is really key. Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense that replaced Donald Rumsfeld, remember in 2006, Donald Rumsfeld became sort of the scapegoat of everything that went wrong in Iraq, and I think for good reason. Gates came in, and about 3 years ago, Robert Gates said, he's now retired, but he said, anyone who considers a ground war in Asia or anywhere else needs to get their head examined. This is the American Secretary of Defense. People think about China now, and they think, oh, well, possibly a ground war. Sorry, guys, we're no longer in a ground war era. It's just the reality. If you see a tank, you're looking at a museum piece. Seriously, it's over. So the rise of drones, I think, reflect the shift of warfare away from being territorially focused. It doesn't mean there won't be examples of that. I'm just saying there's a broader shift here. And we increasingly saw in the last 5 years drones, in terms of American use, drones began to be used more at the end of the Iraq War situation, but really that's not where they were primarily used. They were primarily used in Afghanistan and then particularly in the Pakistani tribal areas. And that's where we saw, I think, the greatest increase in the use of drones initially in about 2009. And in part that reflects the fact that it was so difficult to get American soldiers on the ground. So drones became the proxy for ground troops. And I think that's the trend that we're seeing. Then drones begin to be used in Yemen and in the southern Arabian Peninsula and in Somalia. And increasingly we're seeing drone use in Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, that area. They're flying out of Djibouti, they're flying out of the Seychelles Islands. Drone bases are starting to proliferate around the planet. And of course, a lot of that is the justification for that, and in fact, the use in many cases is towards sort of the increasingly networked nature of Al-Qaeda, right? These networks that have moved from being located in territorial spaces and have their own networks, and drones are kind of following them in a sense. So we're seeing this. We saw the shift under the Obama administration, in a sense, away from ground war to drone war, and I think it's pretty significant. I have a number of concerns with it. Certainly, many that Tim mentioned. Are drones just a new way to kill people? I think that's true. They're a way of distancing our own soldiers and forces from ground combat. That's true. That has implications. We have drone operators around the U.S. in Nevada and New York, near Syracuse, and a number of places who are basically conducting suburban warfare. I mean, they live in the suburbs, they commute to work, they wage war during the day from their trailers or their offices, and then they go home. Can you imagine? There was a piece in the New York Times that talked about, this bizarre sort of disconnect for these men and women who are engaged in this operation. Of course, some people I talked to said, feel really sorry for these people, but what about the people who are on the other side? But it is something new and significant that we have this remote, as Tim put it, remote warfare that's emerging, and what that does to our society. I think the other problem with it is the secretive nature of it. Obama, for the longest time, has he still even admitted? It's kind of like Israel with its mass pile of nuclear weapons. They have their policy of non-declaration. Like, they won't admit it even though everyone knows they have it. And so the drone wars have been kept an official non-secret secret, which is a means of limiting oversight. I mean, that's what's going on. They're trying to limit oversight, and this is part of the disappearing. They're trying to disappear new ways of war from public scrutiny and from public oversight. And then I think the worst thing that the Obama administration did was, for the longest time, and still to some extent, Leon Panetta being the weird exception where every now and then he admits the truth, is that they denied the civilian casualties from the drone wars. When all the journalists who actually made it to these areas, all the studies had come out and said, yeah, indeed, the ratio of civilians killed to targeted, alleged Al-Qaeda or other operatives is actually much higher. And for the longest time, the administration's policy was to say we hadn't killed any civilians, which was ridiculous on the face of it. I mean, any weapon in war is going to kill civilians if it's fired in a civilian context. It's just the nature of war. So it's ridiculous that they were denying this. But I think they know that game is up. So yeah, there are a lot of problems with drones. But what I want to say here with you guys today is that that's just the most visible part that we're seeing. And that's not actually the biggest part of the story. Drones are in an increasingly disappeared nature of warfare, drones are actually the things we can see. It's the things we can't see that I want to talk about a little bit more, that I think drones are playing a part and a role in, and are sometimes used in lieu of, but I actually think drones are not the main story going on. To give you an example, remember the assassination of Osama bin Laden a couple years ago. And let's just take that one case. From what you guys remember, was it a drone strike on bin Laden? You guys all know that. No. I think most people think it was. I think a lot of people think it was. But it was a SEAL team, a Navy SEAL team, a special operations force that conducted the raid. And if you take that night of the raid itself, it was only one of around 20 operations that flew, or I think the number is a little lower, from about 14 operations that flew out of that base in southern Afghanistan on the same night. The only difference with the bin Laden raid is that it went south and crossed the Pakistan border. All the other raids were going on that night within Afghanistan. And this is what I want to develop for you and have you think about a little bit more. In other words, that very night that this incredibly historic and complicated operation took place, there were also, from the very same air base, 10 to 15 operations, and in other bases in Afghanistan, same amount of operations going on. In other words, probably that night alone, there was in the hundreds of operations that were very similar. Special forces teams landing in a location, killing or capturing alleged members of opponents of the United States in Afghanistan. And possibly some in other areas of Pakistan, although this is the only one that we know was reported. And what that's telling us is that, in fact, although indeed over that area of Pakistan you have continuous presence of drones, what you really are having is this net of special forces operations going on all the time, on a nightly basis in particular, but daily too, across Afghanistan and over crossing into Pakistan border. The same is true for the other areas I mentioned, although to a lesser extent. Somalia, where you find drones, you will find a network of special operations forces conducting nightly raids, although much less. Yemen also. We think of the CIA as being the main agent behind the drone war, but in fact, they're not the only agent running, and in some of these cases are not the agent running the drone wars. In fact, what it is that these are being run by a particular network of special operations forces called JSOC, JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, which is the, let's call it the operational arm of special operations forces. JSOC is sort of the command that within special operations forces that directs its actions, its action network, let's call it. And they have their own drone army that I think at this time rivals the CIA's or may even be bigger at this point.
What does the C stand for?
Joint Special Operations Command. And here's what's happening, is I think in this disappearance of war that Tim has mentioned that I endorse, what we're seeing is military actions increasingly being farmed out to networks of special operations forces. And the CIA itself is becoming a paramilitary organization. And what we're seeing is a shift away from the main army, the Marines, the main members of the US military, and they all have their own special forces, special operations forces wings. Navy has the SEALs, the Army has the Rangers, the Air Force has a particular special operations command within the branch of the Air Force, and so on. We have a number of others. It's not just SEAL Team 6. It's not just Rangers. It's right, and what has happened is in the past 10 years, you've seen a massive expansion of the special forces, or I'm using SOF, Special Operations Forces, because Special Forces, we tend to use that word, Special Forces, to talk more about Army, yeah, and Green Berets. Special Operations Forces is really the right terminology here. You've seen a massive expansion in their command, which is, its acronym is SOCOM, S-O-C-O-M, Special Operations Command. And that is now equal to other commands like the Middle East Command or the Asia Command, or you see, because that's how the military branches itself out. And what you have is Special Operations Command, which I believe, and this is my theory that I've been trying to write about, is like, let's get the right biological metaphor. It's no, I don't want to call it a virus, but it's the body that is now, I think, growing within the shell of the old military, and it's the body of what the new military is becoming. Do you see the idea? Yeah. Yeah. Help me out later with a good metaphor, because I've got to write this piece soon. Well, this is, yeah, I like to use neutral language and then let it speak for itself. But look, I mean, it's a complicated story, you know? But that's my thesis. Do you sort of see the main idea? I think that's what's really going on now. And I think if you look at I've been trying to figure out what's going on at Joint Base Lewis-McChord, for example, or other places. I think you can even see in their infrastructure that increasingly it's going to be, you're going to see a bigger role, a growing nucleus of special operations forces units and infrastructure and things like that. So that's the big picture that I think is going on, and drones are related to it, and drones are an extension of this new kind of warfare. And I call it, and I'll explain this, the increasing rise of networked warfare. Because I think what's really going on here is that if you think of the American military, to use military language, and other militaries too here, I'm just taking this as my case, are largely centralized and hierarchical institutions, and especially in the US military you have separate branches. And so people say, military language, they say it's a stovepiped organization, right? You have your stovepipe to your command, right? You know, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, etc. And then within that you have stovepipes and you have special branches. It's an old form of organization. I mean, very modernist form of organization, which is neat, hierarchical, clear lines, linear, etc. Well, what we're seeing is that through special operations forces, they are adopting a new form of organization that's reflecting, I think, the broader changes in society. Our society is increasingly becoming networked, right? Where you have social media, we're operating in terms of networks. We're not operating as much in terms of hierarchical, centralized organizations. And I think special forces in the United States is representing that trend more than any other part of the US military. So let me just explain that, and I'll tell us a little story to get there. Is that basically what happened was after 9/11, 9/11 attacks happened, and Don Rumsfeld was trying to transform the US military. He and many others. But they were trying to transform the US military. They called it transformation, or other people called it a revolution in military affairs. And what he wanted was he wanted the military to become more like Walmart. And what I mean is, he wanted the military, you know how Walmart is basically a series of stores linked all over the world? And basically a consumer comes in, they want this product, and the idea is you link all the various chains in this network, including production chains, to deliver to that product desire at the point of sale. If you kind of get the logic. Rumsfeld's vision, drawn up by others, was to turn the military, instead of being this sort of big organization that had these chains of linear chains of command and hierarchies that you had to go through. He wanted to become this flexible organization that could adjust to particular situations to the point of engagement. Not the consumer, but the target. And so what he was trying to do was to make the military extremely high-tech with information technologies and create a wired information technology-driven military organization, which meant, and this is why a lot of people in the military resisted him, which meant change in the military, right? And a lot of hierarchies would be busted, and so a lot of people hated him for that in the military, right? But his idea was that you could fight war, and Tim gave the example of Kosovo, which was fought entirely from the air to drive Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian leader, out of his forces out of Kosovo, and it was done completely by the air with no troops. And for Rumsfeld, this was, put it nicely, this was one of the most exciting things ever. This was proof that you could fight wars just with high technology from the air, maybe lightly dust it with some special operations forces, and you don't have to use ground troops anymore. And I think this became a model that for Rumsfeld, and I think many people in the Israeli military as well, I study them as well, but have sought to implement. So anyway, that was what was going on, but then they got into Iraq and Afghanistan, and they did this. That explains a lot of the disasters of both those wars, was that the idea was it was simply an operation to get rid of the current leadership and then turn it over to the people involved. There was no plan for what came after, other than maybe putting our select hand-picked allies in power. And suddenly insurgencies break out, and RMA is not a good answer for an insurgency. It takes troops on the ground. It takes all the terrible stuff that ended up happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. But at the same time, Rumsfeld had this idea that, well, Al-Qaeda is this network all over the world, and what we should do is we should not use our military for that, we should use our special forces. And let's expand that. And so he started developing this whole network of special Philippines, Yemen, Djibouti in Africa, Somalia, in the Caucasus, Chechnya in that area, in different parts of Asia, and even into Central and South America. And the idea was, if our new enemies are a network, we need to build a network. You see the idea? And so that became this nebulous of what I think has grown. And just to put a couple more layers onto the story, so Rumsfeld basically unleashes this sort of global special forces operations, but it took one other person to operationalize this, and that was General Stanley McChrystal. Have you guys heard of McChrystal? He was the head he became appointed in 2003 the head of JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, which was the operational arm of Special Forces. And McChrystal, who was recently fired, he ended up becoming the commander of Afghanistan, right? McChrystal was a ranger, incredibly disciplined man, incredibly driven. He's a very interesting figure in American warfare. If there's someone you should read about, find out about McChrystal, and I think you'll get my story. There's a book called The Operators that Michael Hastings, a Rolling Stones reporter, wrote about him, and actually he's the guy that got McChrystal fired because he quoted him and his minions talking crap about Obama and all these other people. It wasn't McChrystal who said it, let's be fair. It was his people, but it was bad enough, and that's what led to McChrystal getting fired. But The Operators is a pretty good story, I have to say. And it's Michael Hastings. But McChrystal came in, and he understood exactly, this man understood his mission, which was if you're fighting a network, you have to become a network. And what he did was he figured out that he had to get the best high-tech and combine the most agencies within the US government that he could use to track, target, find, hunt, and kill Al-Qaeda, but whoever was alleged to be Al-Qaeda and so on. And you may have heard whispers of this at one point that there was a secretive force that was like Cheney and Bush's secret assassination division. That's what this turned out to be. We didn't know about it. This is one of the most secretive things in the US military and government. But we now know about it. That's why I'm talking about it. And so what McChrystal did was he found a way of saying, okay, let's make a network. Let's get the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, NASA, geospatial analysis. I mean, all these institutions, US government, let's network ourselves and let's create a network out of Navy SEALs, Army Rangers. Do you see? Breaking those stovepipes, combine and link, and remember Rumsfeld's model of Walmart? This is this is more like franchised Walmart, you know, like, and then let's figure out a way, okay, we got a problem in the Philippines, let's mobilize those forces and we'll target that. Let's mobilize those forces and we'll target that. Linking up, daily basis, they would talk around the world. And they created fusion centers, which now this is one of the blowbacks from the wars, we now have fusion centers all over this country, which are joint commands to track anything from alleged terrorist concerns, threats, to drug, to other criminal activities, where it's about jointness. This is the operative adjective, joint, bringing things together, creating a network. And so McChrystal did that. His base was in Balad, in north of Baghdad. And he would shift between Afghanistan and Baghdad. And what he did was he created this global net of special forces operations, who then I think is the nucleus of what we've seen today. Only a couple more pit stops in this story are, and then in Iraq what happened was, and so the QDR that you mentioned, the 2006, it says we call them for the long war. This is what they had in mind, that there would be this network of operations and forces going on all over the world, largely secretive, hunting down and tracking networked enemies. I think that's what the long war, in a sense, the vision of it is. And maybe, of course, you know, still with a few ground wars to finish off. So then what happened was, in Iraq, you guys maybe remember 2007 with the surge. In other words, you know, Iraq went to hell. and then Bush, instead of withdrawing, decided to adopt a new strategy and brought in sort of the best and brightest from the U.S. military, General Petraeus and these other people who indeed are, you know, certainly have the from a military point of view, had the smartest sort of opinion about these kinds of wars to fight from their perspective. And they wanted to engage in what they sort of superficially called a hearts and minds campaign, but it was about flooding troops and trying to bring some kind of reconciliation to Iraq and tamp down the violence and so on and so forth. But basically the story that we are finding out now is that behind the scenes, on a nightly basis, JSOC, McChrystal's boys were out there, and there's a quote from McChrystal that says, we were doing so many operations, the tempo was so high that we turned killing into an art form. That's McChrystal talking about Iraq 2007, 2008. So there were a lot of reasons why violence went down in Iraq at that time, but certainly one of them clearly was, I'm not talking thousands, I'm talking tens of thousands of people were subject to hunt and kill operations. From Sunni, Al-Qaeda, Shiite militias, other groups, it was massive. And that's where they learned how to wage, I think, what is really this new kind of American war. And then where does McChrystal go next? He becomes a commander in Afghanistan, marrying kind of a little bit of hearts and minds counterinsurgency by day, and by night, kill capture, and ramping up the special forces operations. And that's the model I think that we've seen now that's spreading. And so to sum up my story is, I agree with Tim. I think Tim's points are the perfect frame for what I'm concerned about, which is, if this is surprising you, it's bigger than you think. And that's the problem. It's that it's not in the public anymore, that these things are going on all the time. And these things have a lot of consequences, and we're seeing them today in Pakistan, we're seeing them today in Yemen and Somalia, etc. Is that this is incredibly sophisticated and individualized form of warfare. It's all about information and finding and targeting. So in a sense, it's precise, but don't forget that preciseness in warfare can only be so precise, A. And secondly, it's still a military answer, and I don't mean this in an anti-military sense. I mean this more, it's still a violent answer to a problem that exists. And what I keep on thinking about is, so we have this secretive war that's going on, And when are we going to have our next 9/11? You know, and everyone, like the last 9/11, goes, huh? I didn't see that coming. Well, that's because you weren't following what was going on in the Middle East at that time. And I think the blowback potential for this is big. And we as a public are not having a say in the fact that we are engaged right now. We are engaged in wars in Yemen, in Somalia, increasingly in Africa. What happened in Libya, you know, after the American ambassador unfortunately was murdered. Guess what the response is? Just go look at the New York Times articles, read through them now. One of the responses will now be that the U.S. plans to extend Special Forces Command into Libya with potential for using drones and other things to track these suspects. So now, of course, these people should be tracked and brought to justice. I have no problem with that. But I want to tell you what's the logic here. It's extending Libya now will be under this net, if you see what I'm saying. So I think this is one of the biggest stories that is happening now. And that we need to understand it, that the wars of the future are not going to be the ones that are visible to us. They're going to be these invisible wars. And my biggest concern is that they're in lieu of the other answers that are desperately needed. And all you have to do is look at Yemen, a country where people don't have drinking water, where the debt of the country overwhelms the ability of the country to feed itself. I mean, you can name all these social and political ills in Yemen, and what has our answer been? Yeah, targeting Al-Qaeda, who I have no sympathy for, but simply increasingly sophisticated kill, capture, hunt, kill operations with drones and special forces to go after Al-Qaeda, and in the long run, that's no answer at all. So thank you. Yeah.